In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And a man who greased engine parts for 11 years, crashed on an alien planet, got picked up by an orc the size of a cargo loader, and received the first positive performance review of his entire career. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about Jurrow Seld, a tallow-hand aboard a merchant fleet grain hauler, and if you don't know what a tallow-hand is, neither does anyone else, including most of the people he worked with. He greased things. That was it. Bearings, pistons, shafts, 11 years of rendered fat and a brush. Then the Geller field started going, and the ship came apart over a world that nobody had bothered to name. And 78 survivors crawled out of the wreckage onto a planet made entirely of warm fungus that smelled like a meal you almost recognized. 3 days later, the horizon started moving, and what came out of it was not a rescue. What happens next is not what you think. It's worse. It's also, somehow, funnier. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
96 days after the Measured Allotment broke apart over Ghorrek and dropped what was left of us into the biggest fungal swamp I have ever had the displeasure of not dying in. An orc handed me a wrench the size of my leg and pointed at an engine that was on fire. I put the fire out. He handed me a different wrench and pointed at the same engine. I fixed the engine. He made a noise that I have since learned to interpret as acceptable, and he walked away, and I stood there in a shed on an alien world, holding 2 wrenches I could barely lift, and I understood with total clarity that this was the most valued I had ever been in my entire life. 11 years greasing drive shafts in the belly of a merchant fleet hauler, invisible to every officer and rating aboard that ship. And it took an orc on a planet the Imperium forgot about 3 centuries ago to give me a performance review. It was favorable. I did not die. By local standards, that is a promotion. My name is Jurrow Seld. I was a tallow-hand. If you have never heard that word before, that is because nobody has ever had a reason to say it in a sentence that mattered. A tallow-hand greases machinery. Bearings, pistons, sluice gates, reciprocating shafts, anything that moves against anything else and would prefer not to. You are given a bucket of rendered fat, a brush, and a list of 900 components that need attention every shift cycle, and you work your way down the list until the shift ends or you fall into something, whichever comes first. It is not dangerous, it is not skilled. It is the kind of work the Imperium gives to people it has already decided are not going to become anything else, and I had been doing it since I was 16 years old on a hive world called Kaldavast, where the greatest ambition available to a boy from Midstair 11 was to grease something in a cleaner postcode. I got the posting on the Measured Allotment because the previous tallow-hand died of a lung infection, and I was the applicant whose name was closest to the top of a munitorum labor pool, sorted alphabetically by second syllable. I have never been able to confirm this. I have also never been able to think of a better explanation. The Measured Allotment was a Hazaroth pattern bulk hauler, merchant fleet registry, 1,100 meters of badly maintained hull wrapped around a cargo hold that could swallow a city block. She carried grain. That was it, agri-tithe grain in standardized containers, loaded at one world, carried through the warp for 6 to 9 weeks, depending on how the navigator was feeling and whether the Geller field generators had been properly serviced, which they had not. Grain was unloaded at another world, whose name I was never told, because nobody tells a tallow-hand where the ship is going. You find out when you get there, and usually you find out by the quality of the docking clamps. 411 souls aboard by the last muster I was aware of. Naval officers, merchant fleet ratings, engine seers, servitors, deck gangs, a navigator sealed in her blister on the command spire, an astropath who looked like a strong wind would kill him, and who turned out to be right about that, because he was dead in his cot before the drive section came off, and he was the only means the measured allotment had of telling anyone anything at a distance, and me, down in the drive section, greasing things, for 11 years. The navigator had been refusing food for the last 3 weeks of the voyage. Nobody told us this because nobody tells a tallow-hand anything, but the galley ratings talked, and what they said was that the trays were coming back untouched, and then the trays were coming back broken, and then the servitor that delivered the trays stopped going up to the blister at all because the servitor came back wrong, and the senior helmsman locked the spire access corridor and welded it shut and told the bridge crew that the navigator was resting, which was a word that covered a lot of territory, and 7 days later the Geller field began to go. I do not know what that looks like from the bridge. I know what the standing order is because every rating aboard a merchant fleet hull is told it once and never again, and it is this. When the field starts to fail, you translate. Immediately, wherever you happen to be, because whatever is on the other side of that field does not wait for you to reach a safe position. So they translated. Without a navigator to plot it, a translation does not take you somewhere. It stops taking you, and you are wherever that leaves you, and what it left us was inside the gravity well of a world nobody had ever bothered to name. I did not know any of this at the time. I learned it from the senior helmsman, who survived the crash, and who told Bosun Prat, who told me, and who then walked into the fungal forest on day 9 and did not come back. And nobody went looking for him because he was the man who had welded the door, and he knew what was behind it, and he was done carrying that. I want to tell you that I had a feeling something was wrong, that I sensed a disturbance or noticed an irregularity, or heard a sound that should not have been there. I did not. I was on shift in the portside auxiliary drive housing when the measured allotment fell out of the warp, and what I noticed was that my bucket of tallow slid off the maintenance ledge and hit me in the knee. That was the full extent of my situational awareness. The bucket hit me. Then the lights went out. Then gravity did something that gravity is not supposed to do, and I went from standing on a gantry to being pressed against the ceiling with the contents of my grease bucket distributed evenly across my face, and something large made a sound like the entire ship was being torn in half, which, as it turned out, was because the entire ship was being torn in half. The drive section separated from the main hull at frame 67. I know this because I had greased frame 67 4 hours earlier, and I remember thinking at the time that the bolts looked tired. I did not report this because I am a tallow-hand, and nobody has ever asked a tallow-hand for his opinion about structural integrity, and because bolts on an Imperial ship always look tired. Everything on an Imperial ship looks tired. The ship itself looks tired. It is tired. It has been carrying grain for 200 years, and it wants to stop. And on that day, over that world, it did. The impact killed most of us. I do not know how many exactly, because I was unconscious for what I later estimated to be about 4 hours. And by the time I crawled out of the wreckage of the portside auxiliary housing through a gap in the hull that had not been a gap when I went in, the landscape was already sorting people into categories. The living were sitting or standing in a wide ring around the crash site, staring at the ship the way you stare at something that used to make sense. The dead were everywhere else. Some of them were still inside the hull and would stay there, because the hull was on fire in 7 places, and nobody had the equipment or the inclination to go back in. The drive section had come down nose first into what I can only describe as a bog. Not a swamp, not a marsh, a bog. The kind of ground that is not ground and not water, but has made a private arrangement with gravity that does not include supporting the weight of anything heavier than a boot. The main hull section had come down 300 meters east and broken its spine across a ridge of rock that jutted out of the fungal cover like a bone through skin. Between the two pieces lay a trail of debris, bodies, cargo containers, and things that used to be part of the ship and were now part of the landscape, steaming gently in an atmosphere that tasted like old bread and felt like breathing through a damp cloth. I stood there for a while. There was a woman sitting on a cargo container with blood running down her face, staring at the sky with an expression that suggested she was trying to file a complaint with a department that did not exist. There was a man walking in circles around the nose of the drive section, touching the hull with one hand as if he was checking whether it was real. There was a servitor halfway embedded in the mud, with its legs still moving. I watched the legs for probably longer than I should have, because they were the only thing in my field of vision that was still doing its job. I respected that. The servitor had been programmed to walk, and it was walking and being upside down and buried to the waist in fungal mud had not changed its assessment of the situation. I have since met Orks who operate on the same principle. Bosun Kalwin Prat found me about an hour later. She was the highest-ranking crew member who had survived with all her limbs in the correct arrangement, which on that particular day qualified her for supreme command of approximately 78 people, most of whom were bleeding, all of whom were terrified, and none of whom had the slightest idea where in the galaxy we were. The bosun was a short woman with a face like a clenched fist and a voice that could strip paint off a bulkhead, and she had been running the deck gangs on the allotment for 9 years, and she took one look at the crash site and the survivors and the burning wreckage and the alien sky overhead, and she said, and I am paraphrasing because the actual words were more colorful, that we were going to organize, take stock, establish a perimeter, and find water, and that anyone who wanted to sit down and die was welcome to do it quietly and out of the way. I had never spoken to the bosun before. I had never had a reason to. She was deck crew. I was a tallow-hand. We existed in different layers of the same ship the way sediment exists in different layers of the same rock. But she looked at me and she looked at the grease still covering most of my face and uniform, and she said, "You, greaser, can you fix things?" And I said, "I can grease things, which is not the same," and she said, "Today it is the same. Get moving." So I did. The world was wrong. I do not mean that in a poetic sense. I mean it in a mechanical one. Everything about it was slightly off in a way that made your skin want to leave your body and go somewhere else. The ground was a thick mat of fungal growth that went down at least a meter before you hit anything solid, and it was warm, and it pulsed faintly in a way that made me think it was breathing, which I am fairly certain it was not, but which I have never been able to completely rule out. The vegetation, if you could call it that, was fungal. Enormous mushroom-like structures the size of hab blocks, with caps the color of old bruises and stalks covered in what looked like pustules, but turned out to be smaller fungi growing on the larger fungi. Everything grew on everything else. The air was thick with spores. You could see them drifting in the light, millions of tiny particles hanging in the atmosphere like dust in a manufactorum, except that dust does not try to take root in your lungs. We did not know that at the time. We learned. The sky was the color of a healing wound, yellowish-green near the horizon and darkening to something like ochre overhead, and there was no sun visible, just a diffuse brightness that came from everywhere and nowhere and made shadows behave strangely. The temperature was warm, uncomfortably warm, the way the lower decks of a ship are warm, except that on a ship you know the warmth comes from the engines, and here the warmth came from the ground, from the fungus. The entire landscape was generating heat, slowly, constantly, the way a compost heap generates heat, and the smell was exactly what you would expect from a compost heap the size of a continent. It was not unpleasant. That was the worst part. It smelled like food, like the protein porridge they served in the crew mess, or the yeast cakes my mother used to make on Kaldivast. The cheap ones with the brown crust that tasted like nothing but filled you up. The entire planet smelled like a meal you could almost recognize but could not quite place, and it made you hungry. And being hungry on a world you did not understand was a particular kind of cruelty that I do not think the world intended, but which it delivered with absolute competence. We found water on the second day. It was brown. It tasted like mushrooms. Everything tasted like mushrooms. Bosun Prat had us boiling it over fires made from pieces of the ship's interior paneling, and the boiled water tasted like hot mushrooms, which was not an improvement but was at least sterile, or so we hoped, although I am not sure any of us were qualified to have an opinion on the sterility of alien fungal water. A rating named Paul Denner, who had worked in the galley before the crash, took charge of food, which meant he took charge of finding out which of the fungal growths surrounding us were edible and which were not. His method was simple. He fed them to a grot. But I am getting ahead of myself. There were no grots yet. On the second day, there was just us, and the wreckage, and the fungus, and the silence. The silence was the thing that scared me most. Not the absence of sound, because there was plenty of sound. The fungal forests creaked and groaned as they grew. The bog made wet sucking noises. Insects the size of my fist buzzed through the spore clouds, and somewhere in the distance something large was hitting something else that was also large, rhythmically, like a hammer on an anvil, except that the hammer weighed about 6 tons and the anvil was screaming. We did not investigate that sound. We did not investigate anything. We had 78 people, 9 of whom had injuries that would kill them within the week. No weapons beyond what could be salvaged from the wreckage, which turned out to be 4 lasguns with depleted power cells, a naval cutlass, and a fire axe, and no idea whether the planet was inhabited. The sound in the distance answered that question on the 3rd morning, when the horizon to the north began to move, and Bosun Prat climbed to the top of the drive section with a salvaged scope, and looked for a very long time, and then climbed back down, and said one word, which was not one word, but a sentence that began with a profanity, and ended with the word Orks. And that, as they say, was that. I had never seen an orc before. Most people in the Imperium have never seen an orc before. You hear about them. You see the propaganda posters, the ones the Munitorum puts up in transit terminals. Green monsters with red eyes and big teeth and crude weapons. And the poster says something like, "Report all greenskin sightings to your nearest commissar." And you look at it and you think, well, that is clearly an exaggeration designed to frighten children and idiots. Because nothing that large could possibly be that stupid and still be alive. I would like to formally retract that assessment. They are that large. They are that stupid. They are extremely alive. And the reason they are still alive despite being that stupid is that the universe has apparently decided that intelligence is not a prerequisite for success, which tracks with my experience of the merchant fleet command structure and is considerably more alarming when the thing demonstrating it weighs 400 pounds and is carrying a gun made out of a ship's exhaust manifold and what appears to be half a tree. There were about 40 of them. They came out of the fungal forest to the north in a mob, which is the correct word, because that is what orcs call a group of themselves, and it is also the only word in any human language that captures the energy of 40 orcs arriving somewhere simultaneously. It is not a march. It is not a charge. It is a controlled avalanche of enthusiasm, noise, and metal. They were enormous. The smallest of them was a head taller than the tallest man I have ever met, and the tallest of them was something I am not prepared to describe with a number, because the number would sound like a lie, and it was not a lie. They were green. The exact shade of green varied, darker on some and lighter on others, with a yellowish tint in places that I later learned was a sign of age, and their skin had a texture that reminded me of the rubber gaskets I used to grease on the auxiliary drive couplings, thick and ridged and covered in a film of something organic that might have been sweat or might have been something the skin itself produced. They smelled like the planet, which is to say they smelled like mushrooms and iron and something faintly chemical that I could not place then and have since identified as the smell of a biological process that has no human equivalent. They were also laughing. That was the part that undid most of us. The advance, the size, the weapons, the noise, all of that was terrifying, but it was terrifying in the way that a disaster is terrifying, impersonal, and overwhelming. The laughter was personal. They were laughing because they thought we were funny. 70-odd humans standing in a ring around a crashed ship, bleeding and filthy and holding improvised weapons. And the orcs found this hilarious. I know what a threat assessment looks like. I have seen dock gangs on Kaldevast size each other up before a territorial scuffle, the measuring, the calculation, the decision to fight or withdraw based on a quick inventory of numbers and weapons and willingness. The orcs did not do any of that. They did not assess us as a threat. They did not assess us at all. They looked at us the way you look at something a squig has dragged into the yard. Mildly interested. Mostly amused. 3 people died in the first 90 seconds, and none of them needed to. Oddmark, a cargo hand I knew by sight, pulled a gutting knife from his belt and ran at the nearest orc, screaming something about the Emperor. The orc, who was busy examining a piece of hull plating with his fingers, turned around, looked down at Oddmark, the way you look down at a small dog that has bitten your ankle, and hit him with the back of his hand. That was all. One swing, the way you swat an insect, with the exact same level of investment. Oddmark went about 12 feet, hit a piece of wreckage, and did not get up. A rating whose name I never learned tried to run and was stepped on. And I say stepped on because that is what happened. The orc did not chase her or attack her. He simply walked in the direction she was running, and his foot landed where she was, and she stopped being there. The third was a deck officer named Voskin, who drew the naval cutlass and held it out in front of him, steadily and correctly the way they teach you in the officer's basic, and an orc walked into the blade, looked down at it sticking out of his forearm, looked at Voskin with an expression of mild professional interest, pulled the cutlass out of his own arm with his other hand, examined it, decided it was not worth keeping, and dropped it on the ground. Voskin fainted. The orc stepped over him. I do not know whether Voskin was disappointed or relieved that the orc did not consider him worth killing, but I suspect that somewhere in the back of his mind, during the brief period between drawing the sword and hitting the ground, he experienced both. The rest of us did not move. Bosun Prat had shouted "Stand fast," and we stood fast, because there was nothing else to do, and because the bosun's voice was the last familiar thing any of us had. And when everything you know has been taken away, you hold on to whatever is left, even if what is left is a short woman screaming at you not to die. The orcs spread out across the crash site. They were not interested in us. They were interested in the ship. 40 orcs swarmed over the wreckage of the Measured Allotment like children in a toy shop, pulling panels off, ripping conduits out of the walls, fighting each other over pieces of machinery, and making sounds that were unmistakably professional satisfaction. One of them found the main drive coupling and made a noise that went up at the end, the way a question goes up at the end, except that it was not a question. It was an orc experiencing something close to what a human might call delight, if delight weighed 800 pounds and had tusks. Then the Big Mek arrived. I know now that his name was Wernkrunk, and I know now that he was a Big Mek, which is an orc title that roughly translates to senior engineer, except that the word engineer implies training and qualifications, and a relationship with physical law that is at least cordial, and Wernkrunk had none of those things. What Wernkrunk had was an instinctive, bone-deep, possibly genetic understanding of how machinery worked, or rather how machinery could be persuaded to work, and a set of tools that appeared to have been made by welding other tools to a third, larger tool and then hitting the result until it became a single object. He was bigger than the others, not taller, wider. He had augmented himself with mechanical parts, a metal jaw that clicked when he talked, one eye replaced by a lens assembly that whirred and refocused constantly, and his left arm was entirely mechanical from the shoulder, ending in a hand that had 7 fingers, 4 of which were wrenches. He came out of the fungal tree line on a vehicle that I refuse to call a vehicle because it violated every principle of engineering I had absorbed in a career spent maintaining machinery. It had wheels of 4 different sizes. It had an engine mounted sideways. It had a cannon on the roof that was pointing backwards. It was on fire in one place and leaking fluid from 3 others. It was moving at approximately 30 miles per hour. It worked. Nobody can explain why orc machinery works, including the orcs. The prevailing theory involves some kind of collective psychic field that I do not understand and do not believe, and which is nonetheless the only explanation that accounts for what I have seen with my own eyes on a daily basis for the last 96 days. Wernkrunk dismounted from the vehicle by jumping off it while it was still moving. The vehicle continued for about 50 meters, hit a piece of hull wreckage, flipped over, and exploded. Wernkrunk did not look back. He walked to the nose of the drive section, put his mechanical hand on the hull, and made a sound. It was a long, low, rumbling sound, and it came from somewhere deep in his chest, and it was the sound of an orc who has just found something very, very good. He walked the length of the wreckage. He looked at the engines. He looked at the cargo hold supports. He looked at a coolant pump that I had greased 2 days before the crash, and that was now hanging from a broken mounting bracket, still dripping. And he made a different sound, shorter, higher, almost appreciative. Then he turned around, looked at the 40 orcs who were busy looting the wreckage, and bellowed a single word that hit us like a physical force. Every orc stopped. Every hand released whatever it was holding. 40 green heads turned to look at the Big Mek, and Wernkrunk pointed at the ship, pointed at the ground, pointed at himself, and said another word, and every orc in the crash site immediately put down what they were carrying and stepped back. I found out later that the first word was something like stop, and the second word was mine. That was the moment we stopped being survivors and became salvage. What I understood was that the looting had stopped, and the casual violence had stopped, and a large orc with a mechanical arm was now walking among the 70-something humans who were standing in the middle of his newly claimed property, looking at us with the expression of a man who has found a bonus he did not expect in a shipment he already considered excellent. He walked up to Bosun Pratt, who came up to approximately the middle of his chest, and looked down at her. She looked up at him. Neither of them moved. Pratt had her hands at her sides and her chin up, and Wernkrunk had his head tilted at an angle that I have since learned means thinking, which is not the same as considering, because considering implies weighing options. And thinking, for an orc, is more like a machine warming up before it runs a program it was always going to run. He reached down and picked up Pratt's hand. She did not flinch. He turned her hand over. He looked at her fingers. He spread them apart with his mechanical thumb, examined the joints, tested the range of motion, and grunted. Then he dropped her hand and walked to the next person in line, who was me, because I was standing next to the bosun, for no reason other than she was the only person I trusted to tell me when to run. He picked up my hand. I flinched. He did not notice, or if he did not care, which amounts to the same thing. He turned my hand over and looked at it the way I look at a bearing sleeve when I am deciding whether it has another 6 months in it. My hands were covered in grease and tallow. They always were. 11 years of handling rendered fat and machine oil had stained the skin permanently, black in the creases, gray across the palms, and the cuticles had the particular cracked, hardened quality that you only get from daily chemical exposure. Wernkrunk looked at my hands for a long time. He rubbed his mechanical thumb across my palm. He felt the calluses. He smelled my fingers, which was not an experience I would like to repeat, and was the most thorough professional evaluation I have ever received. Then he made the sound again. The good sound, the one that meant acceptable, valuable, mine. He dropped my hand and moved on, and I stood there with my hand still extended, covered in tallow and orc spit. And I realized that I had just been appraised. Not as a person, not as a prisoner, as a component. He went down the line. He looked at hands. He tested grips. He examined fingers and wrists and forearms, and occasionally he would pick up a tool from the debris and put it in someone's hand and watch how they held it. And if they held it correctly, he made the good sound, and if they did not, he made a different sound, shorter, dismissive, and moved on. A man bleeding out inside himself cannot close a hand on a spanner, and 9 of us could not, and every one of them went to the other side. That was not mercy, and it was not medicine. It was a grip test, and it sorted the dying out of us, more accurately than 78 frightened people would have managed on our own. The people who got the good sound were moved to one side. The people who got the short sound were moved to the other. I was in the good sound group. So was Pratt. So was Cog-Adept Nelward, the only surviving engine seer who had been pulled out of the wreckage with a broken collarbone, and whose hands, even injured, moved with the automatic precision of someone who had been trained by the machine god to treat every physical object as a prayer. Wernkrunk spent a long time with Nelward. He examined the mechadendrites. He tapped the augmetic eye. He looked at the tools still mag-locked to the engine seer's belt, and picked each one up and turned it over, and made sounds that were not words, but that contained, unmistakably, something very close to professional respect. Then he picked up Nelward and carried him under one arm to the good sound group, and set him down the way you set down a box of parts you intend to use later, carefully because the contents are valuable, and you would rather they did not rattle. 29 of us made the good sound group. The other 46 did not. I felt relief. Not solidarity, not guilt. Relief. The kind you feel when a machine fails in a direction that is not towards you. The 46 were not killed. What happened instead was worse. Wernkrunk looked at them, made a sound that was neither good nor bad, but final, and gestured in a direction that was approximately east. A mob of orcs, smaller ones, the kind I later learned to call boys, herded them in that direction with the casual indifference of men moving furniture. Some of those 46 I saw again weeks later in the sprawl of the Orks settlement. They were alive. They were working. They were carrying things, hauling scrap, feeding animals that I hesitate to call animals, doing the labor that requires a spine and a pair of legs and nothing else. They had been absorbed into the general economy of the green-skinned settlement, dropped into the bottom of a hierarchy that extended below the grots, which is saying something, because grots are the bottom of everything. A few of them I never saw again. I asked once, and the answer I got from old Cranmer, who had been on Ghorrek long enough to know how to answer questions like that, was that some people attract the attention of the dock and some do not, and the ones who attract the attention of the dock are sometimes returned and sometimes not, and there is no pattern to it that any human has ever been able to identify, because the dock's criteria are not criteria in any sense a human would recognize. They are impulses. He sees something that interests him professionally, the way a Mekboy is interested by a machine, and he takes it apart to see how it works. Sometimes he puts it back together. Sometimes he does not. Sometimes he puts it back together differently. We were marched north. I say marched because that is the Imperial word for being moved from one place to another in a group. But what happened was that the 29 of us walked in the general direction that Wernkrunk pointed, surrounded by Orks, who were not guarding us so much as walking in the same direction and occasionally bumping into us, which when an Ork bumps into you feels approximately like being hit by a slow-moving cargo loader. 2 people fell down. One was helped up by an Ork who grabbed him by the front of his shirt and lifted him to his feet and set him down and kept walking. And the gesture was not kind and it was not cruel and it had no emotional content whatsoever. It was the gesture of someone picking up a dropped tool and putting it back on the bench. The other was stepped over. Both survived. The Ork who helped the first one did not look at him during or after the action, and gave no indication that he remembered doing it 5 seconds later. Orks do not remember small actions the way humans do. They do not assign meaning to things that do not involve fighting, building, or eating. Helping someone up is not a category of experience that registers in whatever serves an Ork as long-term memory. It happened. It is gone. The Ork has moved on to thinking about something else, assuming the Ork was thinking at all, which is an assumption I have learned to make cautiously and with significant reservations. Wernkrunk's workshop was about 4 kilometers north, and it was the most terrifying building I have ever entered. And I say building in the loosest possible sense, because a building implies design, and a workshop implies organization, and neither of those words accurately describes a structure that appeared to have been assembled by throwing metal at a hillside until some of it stuck. It was enormous, 3 stories high at least, with walls made of hull plating, sheet metal, corrugated panels, and at least one section that I recognized, from the shape of the sponson mount, as the flank of an Imperial battle tank. There is a great deal of that on Ghorrek. Hull plate, road wheels, a turret ring set into a wall as a door frame. Whatever the Imperium sent to this region 3 centuries ago did not leave it, and the Orks have been wearing it ever since, which is as close to an explanation of the word denied as I am ever going to get. The roof was partly solid and partly open, covered in places by tarpaulins made of cured squig hide, and in other places by nothing at all, so that rain and spores and the occasional small flying creature came and went freely. The interior was a single vast space filled with machinery, workbenches, tool racks, piles of scrap, half-assembled vehicles, fully assembled vehicles that did not work. Things that were not vehicles but that had wheels bolted to them for reasons that may have been aesthetic, and approximately 160 grots. The grots. I need to talk about the grots. Gretchen, technically, but nobody calls them that. Not the orcs, not the humans, not even the grots themselves. They are small, about the size of a human child, green, and possessed of a cunning that is inversely proportional to their size, which means they are the most devious creatures per kilogram that I have ever encountered. They infest the workshop like vermin. They live in the walls, in the crawl spaces, under the workbenches, in hollowed-out engine blocks, anywhere that an orc cannot easily reach. And they emerge to steal food, steal tools, steal parts, fight each other, fight us, and perform the one function that makes them indispensable to the Mekboy operation. They hold things. They hold lamps. They hold wrenches. They hold panels in place while the Mekboy welds. They hold wire while the Mekboy cuts. They hold each other in place while the Mekboy demonstrates a point about structural integrity that involves hitting. They are paid in food, which is to say they are allowed to eat the fungal growths that sprout from every surface in the workshop and in the leftover parts of whatever animal the orcs have most recently killed and consumed. They are terrible at their job. They drop things. They lose things. They swap the tools when you are not looking. They steal anything small enough to carry and hide it in caches that are distributed throughout the workshop according to a system that I have spent weeks trying to map, and which I believe is based on spite. They are also the closest thing to an ally we have, and I use the word ally in the same sense that a drowning man considers a plank an ally. It will not save you. It might delay things. The grot who was assigned to me was called Stick. I do not know if this was his real name or a description. He was about 3 feet tall, weighed maybe 30 pounds, had ears that were larger than his head, and teeth that looked like they had been installed by someone working from a diagram that they were holding upside down. His job was to hold my lamp and pass me tools. And he did both of these things with a level of competence best described as intermittent. He would hold the lamp perfectly steady for 10 minutes and then suddenly point it at the ceiling and refuse to bring it back down until I gave him something, usually a bolt or a scrap of wire, which he would examine carefully, bite once, and add to a pocket that appeared to contain the entire inventory of a small hardware store. He stole 3 of my wrenches in the first week. I found 2 of them in a wall cavity behind a piece of boilerplate. The third I never found. I suspect he ate it, because grots will eat metal if they are bored enough. And Stick was a creature who achieved boredom the way other creatures achieve enlightenment, through sustained and focused effort. The grain was the first thing Wernkrunk lost interest in. 400 standardized containers of agri-tithe grain, enough to feed a hive district for a season, split open across 300 meters of Ghorrek surface, and the orcs had no use for any of it. Orcs eat meat, mostly squig and fungus, which grows everywhere on Ghorrek without encouragement or cultivation, and which constitutes the entire agricultural policy of the greenskin species. That policy being, why would you grow food when food grows itself? The grain sat in its broken containers, and the fungal substrate colonized it within a week, converting it into something that was no longer grain, but was not yet mushroom, a transitional substance that the grots ate with enthusiasm, and which the squigs ate with more enthusiasm, and which I ate because there was nothing else, and which tasted, by the 3rd week, better than the grain had ever tasted in the crew mess, which tells you either something about the fungus or something about the crew mess, and possibly both. Wernkrunk used the empty containers as building material. The grain itself he considered waste, which is the only time I have ever seen an orc apply that word to food. It tells you everything about the orc relationship with agriculture, which is that they do not have one, because they do not need one, because their entire civilization is built on a biological platform that feeds itself. The idea that you would carry food from one place to another in a metal box across the void of space struck Wernkrunk when I tried to explain it as the single stupidest thing he had ever heard a human say. And he expressed this opinion by picking up a handful of the fungus-colonized grain, eating it, and then looking at me with an expression that said, "Your species carried this," and gesturing at the mushroom forest that surrounded us in every direction. I did not have a rebuttal. The first 3 days in the workshop were the strangest of my life, and I say that as a man who had recently survived a spaceship crash on an alien planet. Wernkrunk put us to work immediately. There was no orientation. There was no explanation. There was an orc pointing at a machine and making sounds, and you either figured out what he wanted or you did not. And if you did not, he pointed again, louder, because volume is the orc approach to every communication problem. And if you still did not understand, he would pick you up and physically place you next to the part he wanted you to work on, and put a tool in your hand, and close your fingers around it, and then stand there watching you with his head tilted until you started doing something. The something did not have to be correct. It had to be something. Wernkrunk, I learned, valued activity over accuracy. An incorrect repair could be fixed. An idle pair of hands was an offense against the natural order. He operated on the assumption that any sufficiently motivated creature, given tools and materials and enough time, would eventually produce something useful. And he was not entirely wrong, because desperation is a remarkable teacher, and we were the most motivated creatures on the planet. I was assigned to the secondary engine project. I call it a project because I do not have a better word. Wernkrunk was building something. He was always building something. At any given time, there were between 4 and 9 machines in various stages of assembly in the workshop. And what those machines were supposed to do was not always clear, even to Wernkrunk, who would occasionally stand in front of a half-built device, stare at it for 20 minutes, shrug with his entire body, and start attaching new components to it in a direction that bore no relationship to whatever he had been doing previously. My job was to keep the moving parts lubricated. That was it. That was the extent of my contribution to Ork engineering. I greased things. The same job I had done on the Measured Allotment. The same job I had done on Kaldavast. The same job I would apparently be doing until I died, which on Ghorrek could happen at any moment and for any reason and would not be investigated. But there was a difference. On the Measured Allotment, nobody noticed my work. The engine ran, the bearings did not seize, the shafts did not overheat, and nobody connected these outcomes to the man with the tallow bucket who crawled through the drive section twice a shift. On Ghorrek, Wernkrunk noticed. He noticed because he noticed everything that happened to his machines, the way a parent notices everything that happens to a child, except that the parent in this analogy was 7 feet tall and prone to expressing approval by hitting the approved thing with a spanner. The first time I greased a bearing assembly on the secondary engine and the shaft turned smoothly, Wernkrunk stopped what he was doing, walked over, tested the shaft with one finger, listened to the sound it made, and looked at me. He looked at my hands. He looked at the grease. He made the good sound. Then he went back to what he was doing. That was the first conversation I had with my employer. On the 4th day, Doc Skizzle came, and I will now describe Doc Skizzle, and I will try to do it without my hands shaking, which is something I have not been able to guarantee since the second time he visited the workshop. Doc Skizzle was a pain boy, which is the Ork word for a medical professional, and I use the word professional in the same sense that you might call a flood a plumber. He was not as large as Wernkrunk, but he was considerably more decorated. If you consider blood spatter and surgical implements, bolted directly to the body to be decoration, which Doc Skizzle clearly did. His right arm ended in a clamp. Not a hand with a clamp on it, a clamp. The hand had been removed and replaced with a surgical instrument that could grip, cut, and inject fluids, and which was permanently stained the color of old rust. His apron, if it was an apron and not simply the front of his body, was covered in stains that came from at least 4 different species. He had a grot on his shoulder. The grot held a lamp and a bone saw, and had the expression of someone who had seen things that had permanently recalibrated his understanding of what was possible, physically, with a living body and no anesthetic. Skizzle had come for a checkup. Not his checkup, ours. Wernkrunk had new equipment, and Doc Skizzle wanted to inspect it, because pain boys are, in their way, as compelled to examine living things as Mekboys are compelled to examine mechanical ones. It is not curiosity. It is a drive, the way water is driven downhill, except that the water in this analogy wanted to know what your spleen looked like, and had a set of tools specifically designed to answer that question without waiting for your permission or your death, whichever came first. He walked down the line of 29 humans, looking at each of us, and he did not pick up our hands. He picked up our heads. He tilted them. He looked in our ears. He looked in our mouths. He pressed his clamp against our chests and listened to our hearts with an ear pressed flat against the metal. And he made notes, or what passed for notes, which involved scratching marks into a piece of bone with a metal stylus. When he got to Cog Adept Nelwood, he stopped. He stared at the mechadendrites. He stared at the augmetic eye. He poked the chest plate with one finger and heard the bionic heart beneath it click and whir, and he turned to Wernkrunk and said something that was either a question or a diagnosis, and Wernkrunk said something back that was either an answer or a territorial claim, and the two of them argued loudly for about 30 seconds, and then Wernkrunk hit the workbench with his mechanical fist hard enough to dent the metal, and Skizzle made a noise that was not agreement and was not disagreement, but was the sound of an orc deciding this fight was not worth having today, and he moved on. Nelwood was not taken. Others were not so fortunate. The doc came back 6 days later and took a rating named Imel, who had been complaining of chest pains since the crash. He was returned 2 days after that. He was alive. He was no longer complaining of chest pains because Doc Skizzle had replaced whatever was causing the pain with something that was not causing pain, but which also was not, in any medical sense, a solution. Imel had a metal plate where 3 of his ribs used to be, attached by bolts that went through his skin on both sides, and his left lung now made a clicking sound when he breathed that was audible from 3 meters away. He could not explain what had happened to him during the 2 days, because he had been unconscious for most of it, not through anesthesia, but through what I suspect was the orc equivalent, which is being hit very hard on the head. He said the pain was gone. The words came in a voice that suggested he was not entirely sure the absence of pain was an improvement over its presence, and I did not press him because the look in his eyes was the look of a man who has been on the wrong side of a learning experience and does not want to discuss what was learned. Some were not returned at all. Cog Adept Nelwood survived only because Wernkrunk wanted him, and what a Big Mek wanted a pain boy did not take, not because of respect or protocol, but because of size and the willingness to use it. Wernkrunk was bigger. That was the beginning and the end of the legal system. The doc could have anything that was not already claimed by something larger than the doc, and Wernkrunk was larger than the doc, and we were Wernkrunks. And that possessive was the only thing standing between us and an operating table that I do not want to describe, because describing it would require me to acknowledge that I know what it looks like. And I do, because I have seen it, and I would prefer to stop knowing. I settled into a routine, and I am not proud of how fast. I greased my first bearing on day 4. By day 8, I had a system. By day 12, I had a preferred order of operations and opinions about which of the workshop's grease supplies was better suited to high-friction applications versus low-load bearings. By day 15, I was annoyed that Stick kept stealing my best brush. I had become, without any conscious decision, an employee. Somewhere in there, I stopped boiling the mushrooms. I do not know when this began. I know that on day 6, I would not touch them without 20 minutes over a fire, and by day 14, I was pulling them off the workbench supports and eating them raw while I worked, and they tasted fine. Better than fine. They tasted the way ship rations were supposed to taste, and never did, filling and faintly sweet, and my stomach, which had spent the first week in open revolt against everything Ghorrek had to offer, had gone quiet in a way that felt less like adaptation and more like agreement. My hands were changing too, but I put that down to the different grease. The skin between my fingers looked different in certain light, a faint discoloration in the creases that I scrubbed at without effect, and then stopped scrubbing at because there were bearings to grease, and my hands were the last thing worth worrying about. The universe had crashed my ship, killed most of my colleagues, dropped me on an alien world, and handed me to a green-skinned monster with a wrench for a hand, and my response was to keep doing the only thing I knew how to do, because a man who can grease a drive shaft does not stop being a man who can grease a drive shaft just because the drive shaft is now in a shed that smells like mushrooms and the foreman is an orc. Routine is the only thing that works. The workshop ran on a schedule that was not a schedule. Wernkrunk woke up when he woke up, which was usually announced by the sound of something heavy being dropped on something metal, and worked until he stopped, which was announced by the sound of something heavy being thrown at a grot. Between those two events, the workshop operated at a level of sustained chaos that I can only compare to the engine room of the Measured Allotment during an emergency drill, except that Ork emergency drills last all day. And nobody is drilling. Everyone is genuinely trying to do 8 things at once, and at least 3 of those things are on fire. A typical day involved Wernkrunk simultaneously working on 2 vehicles, a weapon modification, and something that might have been a generator or might have been a musical instrument. It was hard to tell, while shouting instructions at grots who did not listen, throwing tools at grots who had listened but had done the wrong thing, and occasionally stopping to examine something one of us had done with the silent, focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. Except that the bomb was a fuel coupling and the man was deciding whether the coupling was good enough to keep or whether he should eat the grot who had installed it incorrectly. I learned the hierarchy. Wernkrunk was at the top. Below him were his boys, 6 orcs, who served as guards, laborers, and enthusiastic test pilots for vehicles that were not ready to be tested, a role that killed one of them during my 3rd week, and which was filled by a different orc the next day, the same way you would replace a broken socket on a wrench set, by finding one that was approximately the right size and hitting it into place. Below the boys were the grots, maybe 160 of them, who did everything that the orcs could not be bothered to do, and a fair number of things that the orcs could not physically do because their hands were too large for the work. Below the grots were the squigs, which were fungal animals that served variously as food, guard dogs, waste disposal, ammunition, and one specimen the size of a cargo hauler that appeared to serve no function at all beyond sitting in the corner of the workshop and growling at anyone who came within 5 meters, which Wernkrunk considered a security system, and which I considered an oversight in the food chain. And below the squigs, at the very bottom of every list, every category, every conceivable ranking of value and importance, were us, the humans. 29 of us at the start, 24 by the end of the 3rd week, 3 to the dock on his 2nd visit, 1 to a structural collapse when a vehicle Wernkrunk was testing fell off its jacks and landed on a man named Pettin, who was underneath it adjusting a suspension link, and 1 to a squig, which I will not describe because the squig was not at fault, and the man had been warned twice by grots who had lived with squigs their entire lives, and who communicated the warning in the most direct way available to them, which was to scream and point. The communication problem solved itself after a fashion. Not in the way you are thinking. I did not learn the Ork language, because the Ork language is not a language in any way that a linguist would recognize. It is a collection of sounds, gestures, hits, grunts, postures, and facial expressions that convey meaning through volume, repetition, and the credible threat of violence. Wernkrunk had about 30 words that he used regularly, and I learned them all, and they were enough, because an Ork mechanic does not need a large vocabulary. He needs this, that, there, stop, go, good, bad, mine, hit it, and a word that roughly translates to why is this not working, and which is delivered at a volume that suggests the machine is personally responsible for its own failure. Beyond these, communication was physical. Wernkrunk pointed. He demonstrated. He showed me what he wanted by doing it once, and then standing back and watching me do it. And if I did it correctly, he walked away, which was approval. And if I did it incorrectly, he picked up whatever I had done wrong and held it in front of my face, and made a sound that was not a word, but which conveyed, with absolute precision, the sentiment you have failed the machine, and the machine deserved better. Nelward was the one who troubled me. The engine seer worked beside me at the secondary engine, his broken collarbone healing crookedly because the dock's idea of setting a bone involved a hammer, and Nelward had declined the consultation, and I watched him across those first weeks the way you watch a crack in a wall. Not because it is doing anything right now, but because you know it will. He was Mechanicus. He had been trained in the rites of maintenance, the litany of ignition, the prayer of lubrication, the entire liturgical framework that the Adeptus Mechanicus wraps around the act of fixing things the way the ecclesiarchy wraps prayer around the act of existing. And here was Wernkrunk, who had no rites and no prayers and no training, fixing things that should not be fixable by picking them up and bending them and hitting them and bolting new parts onto them in configurations that violated every principle Nelward had been taught were sacred. On day 19, Wernkrunk fused 2 incompatible power couplings by wrapping them in copper wire and hitting the join with a rock. And the coupling worked. Nelward stared at it. Not for a second or two, the way you glance at something odd. He stared at it long enough for the workshop noise to come back and go again, and the engine seer's remaining augmetic eye was doing something I had never seen it do before, the iris cycling through focus ranges as if it was trying to find a setting that would make what he was seeing make sense. He never found one. He went back to work, and he did not pray before he started, and I do not think he noticed. And I noticed because the absence of prayer before work is not something a man does on purpose. It is something a man does when the prayer has stopped being connected to the thing it was supposed to invoke. Wernkrunk hit me on the shoulder that evening, not hard, the way you tap a tool that is where it should be, and the tap was not affection, and it was not encouragement, it was inventory. He was checking that I was still there. In 96 days, Wernkrunk has never hit me, and this is not because he is kind, because kindness is not a concept that applies, but because you do not hit a tool. You hit things that are in the way of the tool. You hit things that are threatening the tool. You do not hit the tool itself, because the tool is the point, and damaging the tool is the one form of waste that Wernkrunk considers unforgivable. The boys hit us. Not often, and never with any intention behind it, which is the part that took me longest to understand, and which has killed 4 of us. An orc, passing another orc in a narrow space, hits him, and the other one hits back, and both of them keep walking. It is a greeting. It is how they establish that the other thing is solid and alive, and still worth walking past. They do it to us as well, because we are in the workshop and we are moving, and that is the whole of the criterion. And a greeting delivered at orc weight into something that weighs 1/5 of an orc is not a greeting anymore. A man named Marth went into a machine bench and did not get up. 3 others died over the following weeks of the same thing, arriving in different places. Nobody was punished, because there is no act here to punish. Wernkrunk would have been annoyed about the loss of a working pair of hands, and puzzled by the question, the way you would be puzzled if somebody asked you to discipline a doorway. We learn to stand in the places orcs do not walk through. That is the entire body of human law on Ghorrek, and it took us 4 men to write it. The grots, on the other hand, hit us constantly. Not hard, because a grot does not hit hard, but frequently and with an enthusiasm that bordered on the professional. They kicked. They threw small objects, nuts, bolts, pieces of fungus, dead insects, and on one memorable occasion a live squig the size of a cat, which attached itself to a man's leg and had to be removed with a pry bar. They tripped us. They put things in our path. They hid our tools and watched from the walls as we searched for them, making a sound that was either laughter or indigestion, and which I have never been able to distinguish between. They did this because we were below them. In the hierarchy of the workshop, a grot outranked a human, and a grot who outranked something was a grot who had to prove it, constantly, because grot status is not a permanent condition. It is an ongoing argument that must be won every day, and the arrival of creatures even lower than grots was the best thing that had happened to Stick and his colleagues since the last time a rival grot fell into the squig pen. We were their validation. We were the proof that there existed somewhere in the universe a class of being that was worse off than a grot, and this knowledge sustained them the way food sustains a human, deeply, constantly, and with a satisfaction that was visible in every kick and every thrown bolt. Stick, my personal grot, evolved over the weeks from an antagonist into something that I hesitate to call a companion, but that was at least a known quantity. He still stole my tools. He still pointed the lamp at the ceiling when he wanted something. But he also learned my schedule, in a way, and would have my grease bucket filled and my brush laid out before I arrived at my station each morning. And he would make a sound when Wernkrunk was approaching. That was either a warning or a greeting, but which served the practical function of alerting me to the presence of my employer, giving me time to look busy, which I always was. But looking busy and being busy are different performances, and Stick had an instinct for which one was required at any given moment. He also bit a grot who tried to take my wrench, the good one, the one that fit the bearing caps on the secondary engine. He bit him hard enough to draw blood, and the other grot screamed and dropped the wrench and ran, and Stick picked up the wrench and brought it back to me and held it out, and I took it, and he made a sound that I want to call satisfied, but that was probably just the sound a grot makes when it has defended something it considers its own. Because the wrench was not mine in Stick's mind, and neither was I. I was his. I was Stick's human, the same way the lamp was Stick's lamp, and anyone who interfered with Stick's things was going to get bitten. I cannot express how comforting it was to be someone's property for the second time in the same month. I saw the settlement for the first time in the third week, when Wernkrunk loaded his latest creation onto a flatbed and drove it to the war boss for inspection. The latest creation was, I think, a tank. It had tracks. It had armor. It had a gun of some kind mounted on a turret that rotated sometimes intentionally. It also had a horn that played 3 notes, none of them in tune, which Wernkrunk had installed for reasons that I believe were aesthetic, and which he demonstrated repeatedly on the drive to the settlement by honking at every living thing we passed, including trees, rocks, and a bird that was not there anymore by the time the sound reached it. I was on the flatbed because Wernkrunk wanted someone to keep the turret from rotating during transport, which was my job, and which I performed by sitting on the turret mechanism with my full body weight, while Stick sat on my head and held a spanner that was doing nothing but, which he insisted on holding because grots with spanners outrank grots without spanners, and this was a public appearance. The first one I saw was from the flatbed, and I did not understand what I was seeing. Between 2 scrap metal structures, in a narrow alley that was not wide enough for an orc to walk through, a woman was hanging strips of something on a drying line. She was human. She was wearing clothes made from cured hide, and her hair was tied back with wire, and she moved with the ease of someone who had been hanging things on that line for years. She looked up at the flatbed as we passed, and her eyes found mine, and she did not react. She did not wave. She did not run. She did not do anything that suggested that the sight of a human man on the back of an orc vehicle was unusual. She went back to her drying line. I stared at her until a building blocked my view, then stared at the building. I did not ask Stick. Stick would not have understood the question. There were humans in the Orks settlement who were not from the Measured Allotment. That was all I knew, and I carried it with me for the next 9 days like a stone in my boot. The settlement was a city. I do not use that word lightly. It was not a camp, not an outpost, not a temporary collection of structures. It was a city, built by orcs over what I later learned was at least 2 centuries, and it was a city because it was what got left behind. Cranmer gave me this part flatly, as a thing I would work out anyway. About 60 years ago, Ghorrek had a war boss who got big. Not big the way Krogbad is big. Big enough that other orcs came to him from places nobody here has a name for. Big enough that the fighting on this world stopped being enough for him, and one season he took everything that could leave the ground, and everything worth taking, and he went. Nobody knows where. Nobody here has heard anything since, and nobody here would recognize the answer if they did. What is on Ghorrek now is what was not big enough to go, plus 60 years of what those ones have grown into, and Krogbad is the largest of them. And that is a different thing from being large. It also explains why Wernkrunk builds tanks. Everything in that workshop goes on the ground. In 96 days, I have not seen him build one thing that was intended to go up. And I do not think it has occurred to him that up is a direction. The city goes sprawled across a valley that was maybe 6 kilometers long and 2 wide, with buildings, roads, workshops, forges, pens, fighting pits, at least 3 structures that appeared to be temples or shrines or large barbecues. It was hard to tell, and a population that I estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20,000 greenskins, most of them orcs, the rest grots and snotlings and things I did not have a name for and did not want one. The architecture was what you would get if you gave a civilization unlimited metal, unlimited enthusiasm, and absolutely no concept of aesthetic consistency. Every building was different. Every building was improvised. Every building was, in its own way, perfect, because it did what it needed to do, which was contain orcs. And it did this with the kind of robust over-engineering that comes from a species that solves every structural problem by adding more metal until the problem goes away, or the building gets so heavy it sinks into the fungal substrate, whichever comes first. And on Ghorrek, both happened regularly. War Boss Krogbad was in the center of it, in a structure that I am going to call a palace, because it was the largest building in the settlement, and because Krogbad lived in it. Although the word palace implies luxury, and Krogbad's idea of luxury was a chair made from welded tank treads, and a collection of skulls mounted on the wall that included at least 7 species, 3 of which I could not identify, and 1 of which was human and very old. Krogbad was the biggest orc I had ever seen. He was not the biggest orc on Ghorrek, because I had not yet seen the fighting pits. But he was the biggest orc in any room he entered, which is the qualification for leadership in orc society, a system that is remarkably efficient in that it eliminates all ambiguity about succession planning, and remarkably inefficient in that it requires the current leader to be physically larger than everyone who wants his job, a condition that is maintained through constant fighting, constant eating, and the biological reality that orcs grow larger the more they fight, which means that the war boss is always the orc who has fought the most, which means he is always the most dangerous, which means challenging him is always the worst possible idea, which means the system is self-reinforcing in a way that would make an Imperial bureaucrat weep with envy if the bureaucrat could get past the part where the job interview involves a meat cleaver. Wernkrunk presented his tank. Krogbad looked at it. He walked around it. He climbed inside it. He fired the gun, which worked once, and then made a sound that suggested it was reconsidering its career choices. He climbed out. He looked at Wernkrunk. Wernkrunk looked at him. There was a long silence which, between 2 orcs, means something is being decided, and the decision is being made not in words but in the space between words, in the comparative assessment of size and strength and willingness that 2 predators perform when they meet in a space that only one of them is going to walk out of owning. Then Krogbad kicked the tank. Not hard by orc standards. Hard enough to dent the hull plate. He kicked it again. He kicked it 5 times, and each time the hull dented further, and each time Wernkrunk watched with an expression I could not read then and can now, which was the Mekboy equivalent of a performance review. The kind where both parties know the product is not ready, and the question is whether the product's not readiness is going to be resolved with more work or with violence. After the 5th kick, Krogbad grunted. Not the good sound, not the bad sound, the middle sound, the one that means I see what you are trying to do, and I am not impressed, but I am not going to kill you because you might do better next time. Wernkrunk nodded. We drove back to the workshop. The horn still worked. He played it all the way home. Nobody has ever explained to me what the tanks are for. They fight each other, which is the whole of the local economy and why there is a settlement at all. But a war boss gets bigger by fighting, and the last one who got big enough emptied this world of everything that flew and went somewhere, and Krogbad is the largest of what was left, and he is still eating. Every bearing I pack, every shaft I keep from seizing, is a very small contribution to the day Krogbad is big enough to do what the last one did. Not to me, not to anyone I will ever meet, to somebody. I worked that out in the 2nd month and greased the secondary engine that afternoon, and have greased it every day since. A man who stops working in that workshop stops being a tool. I found the humans on day 31, not our humans, the other humans, the ones who had been there before us, before the measured allotment, before anyone on any ship anywhere had thought to steer a cargo hauler through this particular corridor of dead space. I found them because Wernkrunk sent me to collect parts from a scrapyard on the eastern edge of the settlement, 2 kilometers through the Ork city, with stick on my shoulder and a sack over my back. I walked it with the focused anonymity of a man who has learned that the best way to survive in a place full of orcs is to look like you belong there. I did look like it. I was carrying a sack, I was covered in grease, and I was walking with purpose. And in an orc settlement, a creature walking with purpose is a creature doing something for someone bigger. Nobody interrupts that. They were in a hollow between the scrapyard and a fungal ridge, in a collection of shelters built from salvaged hull plate and tarpaulin, and what appeared to be the rib cage of something I did not want to identify. There were about 60 of them. Men, women, children, humans, living, breathing, functioning humans, dressed in clothes made from cured squig hide and salvaged ship fabric, speaking low Gothic with an accent that had drifted somewhere it had never been before, and looking at me with the expression of people who are not surprised to see a new arrival, because new arrivals are something that happens here, rarely but regularly, the way weather happens, and you do not need to prepare for each individual storm when you have lived through enough of them to know the shape. Old Cranmer was their word for the man who ran the settlement, and old was not a title, it was a description. He is the reason any of this is being said out loud. The settlement has one institution, and it is his box. Every human who has arrived on Ghorrek in 22 years has sat down opposite him once and told it, start to finish, name and ship and posting and what happened, and he writes it down in a bosun's hand on whatever will hold ink. He does not ask questions while you talk. He asks them afterwards, and they are all about dates. I asked him once who the box was for. He said he had stopped having an answer to that around year 11 and had kept writing anyway, because a man who keeps a log does not need a reason to keep a log. He needs a reason to stop, and nobody had given him one. He was at least 70, maybe older, with a face that had been tanned to the color and texture of boot leather by 22 years of Ghorrek's filtered sunlight and spore-thick air. He had been a bosun himself on a survey cutter that had dropped out of the warp in the wrong place 22 years ago, the same way we had, and which had been claimed by the Mekboy of that era, who was not Wernkrunk, but Wernkrunk's predecessor, a Big Mek, whose name Cranmer pronounced like a man who had been saying it for 2 decades and no longer heard how strange it sounded in a human mouth. There had been 38 survivors from Cranmer's ship. 12 were still alive. The rest had died over the years, some to the dock, some to accidents, some to the casual, incidental violence that is the background radiation of life in an orc settlement, and 3, Cranmer said, to giving up, which is a thing that happens to people who wake up one morning and realize that no one is coming and that the morning is going to keep happening anyway. The children were born here. There were 13 of them, ages ranging from infancy to late teens, and they spoke Orcish better than Gothic. And they could navigate the settlement the way I could navigate the drive section of the Measured Allotment, by feel and instinct, knowing which alleys to avoid and which grots to pay, and which orcs were in a mood that meant go around. Cranmer did not ask if we were being rescued. He did not ask because he already knew the answer, and the answer was no, and it had been no for 22 years. And he had stopped asking 12 years ago when the last person in his group who still believed in rescue died of a respiratory infection that the doc could probably have fixed, but which the doc considered insufficiently interesting to bother with. What he gave me was a briefing. flat, ordered, in the voice of a man who has given it before and has no interest in softening it. The first thing he told me was about the water. Boil it, he said, always. Not because of disease, although there was disease, fungal infections that settled in the lungs and the sinuses and the gut if you breathed too deeply in the wrong part of the settlement. Boil it because of the spores. Ghorrek was an orc world, and an orc world is not a world that has orcs on it. It is a world that is orc. The fungal substrate, the mushroom forests, the spore clouds, the squigs, the insects, the soil, the water, the air. Every part of the ecosystem was orcoid. It had grown from the same biological origin as the orcs themselves, the same spores that generated grots and snotlings and squigs and the orcs themselves, a single self-replicating ecosystem that colonized a world the way a stain colonizes a cloth. From the outside in, and then from the inside out, until there was nothing left that was not part of it. The water came through the fungal substrate. It carried spores. The spores were harmless to orcs because orcs were the spores and the spores were orcs, and the whole thing was one organism wearing different hats. The spores were not harmless to humans. They did not kill you. They did not mutate you. They did something worse. They settled in your gut, in your lungs, in your blood. They took root the way any fungus takes root, quietly, efficiently, and without asking. They did not change what you were. They changed what an Imperial medic's instruments would say you were. Cranmer held out his hand. It was a normal hand, 5 fingers, scarred, calloused, human in every way that mattered. He told me to look at the skin between his fingers. I looked. There was a faint greenish tinge in the creases, barely visible, the kind of thing you would not notice unless you were looking for it, and I had not been looking for it. It was not pigmentation. It was a fungal colony living in the surface layer of his skin, feeding on dead cells, producing nothing, harming nothing, and visible only in the folds where the skin was thin enough and moist enough for the colony to express its color. He had the same tinge in the creases of his elbows, behind his ears, and at the base of his neck. Harmless, painless, invisible under clothing, and absolutely, categorically, unmistakably, xenos biological material living on and in a human body, in a concentration that any standard Munitorum intake screening would flag in the first 30 seconds of the first blood draw. Then he set out what that meant without emphasis, because emphasis would imply the information was surprising. It is the foundational fact of life on Ghorrek, and every other fact descends from it. If a ship came, if someone found them, if the Imperium, by some miracle of navigation and interest, sent a vessel to this world, and if that vessel was not here to exterminatus the Orks, but to recover personnel, which Cranmer considered so unlikely that he could discuss it without emotion the way you discuss weather on a planet you have never visited, then the recovered personnel would be screened. They are always screened. It is the first thing that happens. A Mediki draws blood, runs a standard panel, and checks the results against baseline human parameters, and the results would show fungal contamination. Xenos biological markers in the blood, in the tissue, in the lungs, in the digestive system. Not a lot. Not enough to cause symptoms, but enough to flag a form, and the form has a word on it, and the word is contaminated, and the word does not ask how you got contaminated, or whether the contamination is dangerous, or whether you are still the same person you were before the contamination. The word is a binary. You are contaminated or you are not. And once you are, there is a procedure, and the procedure does not have a step that says, and then we check whether the contamination is harmful, because the procedure was written by someone who understood that allowing exceptions to a contamination protocol is the same as not having a contamination protocol. Cranmer told me this on day 31. I had been breathing the air of Ghorrek for 31 days, drinking the water for 29, eating the fungal growths that grew on every surface in the workshop for 26, because the food supplies from the ship had run out on day 5, and the only food available was the food the planet grew, and the planet grew mushrooms, and mushrooms are what we ate morning and evening, boiled, raw, dried, and in one case fermented into something that tasted like regret, and which the Grots considered a delicacy. 31 days. Cranmer gave me the schedule. 3 weeks to show on a blood panel, 6 months to show on the skin, 2 years for the gut flora to be replaced outright, after which a man is running orkoid biology on orkoid food, and no classification system in the Imperium has a category for that, because the Imperium does not study what happens to humans who live on Ork worlds. It studies what happens to Ork worlds when you drop enough ordnance on them. The inside of the people living there is not a research priority. In the hollow between the scrapyard and the fungal ridge, I looked at my hands, at the grease and the tallow stains and the calluses, and at the skin between my fingers, and I could not tell whether the faint greenish tint I saw there was real, or whether I saw it because Cranmer had told me to look. It did not matter. If it was not there today, it would be there next month. I was breathing and drinking and eating on a world made of the thing that does it, and the only way to stop was to stop all three. I had a job to do and a grease bucket to fill and a grot to argue with. Dying on Ghorrek means the substrate takes you and something grows out of it later, and it is not you, and it is usually a squig. I went back to the workshop. I collected the parts Wernkrunk wanted. I greased the secondary engine. Steek stole my brush, and I took it back, and he bit me, and I flicked him on the ear, and he made the noise that meant I would pay for that later. The sun went down. I lay on the mat I had made from ship insulation in the corner of the workshop that Wernkrunk had allocated to me by the simple method of putting a piece of scrap metal on the floor and grunting, and I stared at the ceiling, which was not a ceiling but a gap in the roof through which I could see the sky. And the sky was the color of old blood, and I could hear the settlement humming around me, thousands of orks and grots and machines and squigs and the fungal forest growing at the edges, always growing. I thought about Wernkrunk, who was an alien, who was a monster, who was the worst employer I had ever had by any civilized standard, and who had looked at my hands on the first day and made the sound that meant this one has value, keep it. Nobody on Kaldavast had ever made that sound. Nobody on the Measured Allotment had ever made it either. I did not sleep well, but I slept. And in the morning, Stick was sitting on my chest with the grease bucket already filled, holding the brush in one hand and a dead insect in the other, offering me both with an expression that was either generosity or a complicated extortion scheme. And I took the brush and I left the insect, and he ate the insect, and I went to work. The weeks passed, and I became something I do not have a word for. Not a slave, because a slave knows he is owned and resents it. And I knew I was owned and had moved past resentment into something more like professional accommodation. Not a worker, because a worker implies a contract and a wage, and the theoretical possibility of quitting, and I had none of those things. Not a pet, because a pet is loved. And Wernkrunk did not love me. Wernkrunk did not love anything except his machines, and even that word is too warm for what he felt. He needed them. He maintained them. He improved them. He would work on a single engine for 40 hours without stopping. Not because he was driven by passion, but because stopping was not something that occurred to him in the same way that falling upwards does not occur to a stone. I was part of that process. I was the tallow-hand. I greased the machine. The machine needed greasing. Therefore, I existed. The logic was simple and it was total, and it left no room for anything as complicated as love or hatred or the kind of relationship that requires two parties to acknowledge that the other one has an internal life. Wernkrunk acknowledged that I had hands. That was enough. I learned things about orcs that I do not think any Imperial scholar knows, because Imperial scholars study orcs from behind a lasguns and a classified distance, and I studied them from inside a workshop where the nearest orc was close enough to step on me. Orcs dream. I know this because Wernkrunk talked in his sleep, which is not the same as sleeping. Orcs do not sleep the way humans do. They have a state that is closer to a low idle, the engine still running but the gears disengaged. In that state, Wernkrunk muttered and grunted and occasionally shouted instructions at machines that were not there. Once he sat up in the dark and reached for a wrench that was 3 meters away, and his hand closed around empty air, and he made a sound of such profound dissatisfaction that I was convinced he was going to get up and fix something. He did. He got up, tightened a manifold bolt on the secondary engine, and went back to his idle state, and I am fairly certain he did not wake up at any point during it. Orcs have favorites. Not in the way humans have favorites, with affection and preference and emotional attachment. In the way that a mechanic has a favorite wrench. The wrench is not special. It is not different from other wrenches of the same size, but it is the wrench that has been in your hand for long enough that your grip has worn a shape into the handle, and if someone took it and replaced it with an identical wrench, you would know immediately that something was wrong. I was Wernkrunk's favorite wrench. He reached for me. Not by name, because he did not use my name. I am not sure he knew my name. He called me the same thing he called all the humans in the workshop, which was a word that roughly translates to small thing that fixes, and its being a compound word suggests orcs had needed it before, which suggests that this had happened before, which Cranmer had already confirmed. He reached for me by location. He expected me to be where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing, and if I was not, he made the dissatisfied sound, the one that meant the machine is not where I left it, and I would appear quickly because the dissatisfied sound was 1 step below the angry sound, and the angry sound was 1 step below the throwing things sound, and the throwing things sound was 1 step below the sound that Emil still heard in his sleep, the one that comes with the clamp. Fighting is what they do instead of breathing out, automatic, constant, with no particular intent behind it. 2 orcs passing each other in a narrow space will hit each other. Not out of anger, not out of territory, out of reflex. The hit is a greeting, a confirmation of existence, a way of saying I am here and I am solid and so are you and neither of us is dead yet. Good, carry on. The hit is followed by a grunt, which is followed by continued walking, and neither orc remembers the exchange 5 seconds later. I watched 2 of Wernkrunk's boys fight for 20 minutes over a piece of scrap metal that neither of them wanted. I know neither of them wanted it because at the end of the fight, when one of them had a broken tusk and the other had what I believe was a fractured orbital bone, the winner picked up the piece of scrap, looked at it, threw it over his shoulder, and walked away. The loser picked himself up, found the scrap, looked at it, threw it in a different direction, and also walked away. The fight had not been about the scrap. The fight had been about the fight. The scrap was an excuse. The way a key change is an excuse for a musical modulation, a structural necessity that enables the thing you wanted to do, which was hit someone and be hit, and feel the satisfaction of a body doing what it was built for. The Doc was always watching. Doc Skizzle circled the settlement the way a predatory bird circles a field, high and slow and patient, and when something caught his eye, he descended, and the descent was always faster than you expected. He took 2 more of our people during the 2nd month. One was returned with a metal plate in her skull and a memory gap that covered 3 days and which she did not want to fill. The other was not returned. When I asked Cranmer, who had known the Doc longer than any living human on Ghorrek, why the Doc took some and not others, Cranmer said it was the same reason a Mekboy picks up one piece of scrap and ignores another. It looked interesting. It had a feature he had not seen before. It was the right shape for something he wanted to try. There was no defense against being interesting. The only defense was being claimed by something bigger than the Doc. And the only thing bigger than the Doc was Wernkrunk, and Wernkrunk only protected the things he needed, and the number of things he needed was always smaller than the number of us. We are 19 now, from the original 29, and 8 of those 19 have been modified in some way by Doc Skizzle, and the modifications were never improvements. They were experiments. Completed experiments filed under done. Not successful or unsuccessful, just done. The way a child puts down a toy it has finished playing with. Bosun Prat stopped sleeping near the wreckage on day 42. That is a small detail, and it is the most important thing that happened that month. Since the crash, she had kept her bedroll in the shadow of the drive section's hull, close enough to touch it, and she checked the distress beacon every morning, even though the beacon had stopped transmitting on day 6, when its power cell corroded in the spore-saturated air. She had also, by then, stopped asking Nelward about the transmitter. He built it in the 3rd week out of a Voxcaster mast, a power cell from the drive section, and about 9 days of work, and it functions. I have seen the indicator. It has been putting out an Imperial distress pattern on a naval band since the 3rd week without stopping, because the one thing Ghorrek has more of than mushrooms is power cells nobody is using. What it does not have is anything to talk to. A Vox signal travels at the speed of light, and the nearest listening post is however far away it is, which is a number nobody in the settlement can supply, and the only man aboard who could have sent anything further than that never woke up for the crash at all. Wernkrunk found it in the 5th week. I watched him find it, and I have never been closer to being sick standing up. He walked around the mast twice, put his hand on the housing, opened it, and looked at what was inside for about a minute. Then he did the only thing a mech does to a machine that is working correctly, which is make it do more of what it is already doing. He put a 2nd cell on it and rebuilt the output stage with a piece of something I did not recognize, and the indicator went from steady to very steady, and he made the good sound and walked away and has never looked at it since. He does not know what it says. He does not know that it says anything. A thing that makes no noise a mech can hear, does not move and does not hit anything, is not interesting, and the only reason he touched it at all is that it was in his workshop, and it was running below its capacity. Nelward stood there through all of it with his hands at his sides. Afterwards, he checked the output and told me, in the flattest voice I have ever heard a man use, that we were now transmitting at somewhere between 4 and 6 times the power we had been. I asked him once what he expected to come of it. He said the right does not specify an outcome and went back to work. On day 42, she moved her bedroll into the workshop, claimed a corner near the tool racks, and told Paul Denner to start drying mushroom strips on the exhaust vents for storage, because winter was coming. We did not know if Ghorrek had winter. Pratt did not care. She was not preparing for a season. She was preparing for a future, and a future requires stored food and a dry place to sleep and an acceptance that the present is not temporary. And the moment she moved that bedroll, she became the leader of a settlement rather than the commander of a rescue party, and the rest of us followed her without anyone saying a word about the thing that had changed. The observances stopped around the same time, and that also happened without anyone deciding it. The Measured Allotment had a shrine, which is a word that makes it sound larger than it was. A recess off the main deck with an akihuila bolted above it and a rack for candles, and the office of keeping it belonged to whichever rating was prepared to sign for the candle allocation, because candles are stores and stores require a signature. The rating who signed for ours was a woman off the number 2 hold, whose name I did not know until Cranmer asked me for it, and I could not give it. She did not come out of the hull. Pratt held something on what she believed were the correct days for 5 or 6 weeks. A bosun holds what the calendar says to hold. The difficulty was the calendar. A day on Ghorrek is not a day. The ship's chrono went with the drive section, and by the 4th week we were counting sleeps, and by the 6th, 2 people were counting them differently. The days drifted, then they were further apart. Then there was one that was the last one, and nobody called it that. Nobody has raised it since. Cranmer's children have never seen an aquila. His younger daughter asked me last week what the shape on the front of my coveralls was for, and I found that I could describe it accurately and could not answer the question she had actually asked. Pratt came to me 4 days after she moved that bedroll, not to accuse me of anything, which is what I had been waiting for since the first week, because everybody in that workshop knew which of us the Mek had put a hand on and which of us he had not. She came to ask me to use it. There were 19 of us, and no medici, and no clean water that had not been carried and boiled, and she wanted a length of pipe and a cutting torch, and about 4 hours of somebody's time, and she had worked out that the only human on Ghorrek who could ask for those things was the one Wernkrunk reached for by location. I told her I would not ask. Not because I was afraid of him, though I was. Because a tool that makes requests is not a tool anymore. It is a thing with an interest, and the day Wernkrunk works out that I have one is the day he starts wondering what else I want. She listened to the whole of it. Then she said, "That is a good reason, and I have to ask you again next week." She did. I said no again. We have been doing that for 6 weeks, and neither of us has raised our voice once. On day 64, Skizzle reached for a woman named Ellick, who had been having seizures since the crash, and who was, in the doc's assessment, interesting. Pratt stepped between them and hit the doc in the face with a hole strut she had been using as a walking stick. It was not a hard blow. It was the blow a human can deliver to an orc, which registers as a fact and not as a threat. And the doc looked at Pratt the way a Mekboy looks at a bolt that has done something unexpected, evaluating whether the thing in front of it was worth engaging with. And then Wernkrunk made a sound. One sound. Not loud, not angry, just present, the way a machine's idle hum is present. And the doc looked at Wernkrunk, and Wernkrunk looked at the doc, and the doc looked at Pratt, who was standing in front of Ellick with a strut in her hand, and the absolute certainty in her eyes that she was about to die, and that dying was acceptable as long as it included hitting that orc in the face one more time. The doc turned and walked away. He did not take Ellick. He did not take Pratt. He walked away because Wernkrunk's sound had contained, in its single flat note, the entire legal code of the workshop, which was mine: do not touch. Wernkrunk will die. Nothing on this world dies of being old. One of his boys was killed in my 3rd week, riding a vehicle that was not ready. and Wernkrunk replaced him the next day and did not mention it again. When it runs the other way, we do not become free and we do not become dead. We become unclaimed. The workshop goes to whichever mech is standing closest and wants it, and everything in the workshop goes with it. And we are in the workshop. So whether 19 people are alive next year is a question about whether the next one holds the same opinion about not hitting the tools. Wernkrunk holds it because it is efficient, not because it is an opinion. Cranmer has watched it happen twice. Pratt stood there for a long time after the doc left. Then she sat down and vomited, quietly, into the drainage channel that ran along the floor of the workshop. And I brought her water, the boiled kind, and she drank it and looked at me and said, not as a question but as a statement, we are never going home. On day 79, the ship came. It came out of the sky the way Imperial ships do, with fire and noise and the arrogance of a civilization that believes the sky belongs to it. And for about 11 seconds, I believed in rescue. 11 seconds. That is how long it took for the sound to reach the workshop and for me to run outside and look up and see it. A sharp silhouette against the ochre sky, descending in a powered approach that was not a landing pattern, but a survey pass. It was small, a cutter maybe, or a long-range surveyor, the kind the Navy uses for reconnaissance in advance of a military operation. It circled twice. It did not land. It circled the settlement, then the crash site, then something east of us I could not see, then went up hard and fast, the way a ship goes up when it has finished collecting data. Cranmer was standing next to me. He had come out of his settlement the moment the sound started, and he had watched the ship with the same flat, efficient attention he gave to everything. And when it disappeared into the high atmosphere, he turned to me and said, "Survey." The word came without hope, because hope was not something Cranmer carried anymore. He had put it down somewhere around year 8 and had not gone back for it. He said, "They will have mapped the settlement. They will have counted the structures. They will have estimated the Ork population. They will have noted the crash site and the age of the wreckage. They will have seen the human settlement if they were looking, which they might not have been, because the purpose of a survey is to map the enemy, not to map the enemy's furniture." Then he asked me what the allotment had been carrying and where she had been going. I told him grain, and that I did not know where, and he nodded as though I had confirmed something. A hull that does not arrive gets reported overdue. An overdue report gets a loss entry. A loss entry carries a last filed heading, and a heading that runs through a region nobody has surveyed in 3 centuries is a navigational hazard, and a hazard gets a tasking. Then he told me his own cutter had gone missing 22 years ago, and that he had spent the first 6 of those years expecting exactly this, and the next 16 not expecting it. 11 weeks is not long enough for a hull to be reported overdue, entered as a loss, cross-referenced and answered with a ship. 11 weeks is long enough for the report to reach the desk it will sit on. Whatever was overhead was not here about us. It was the answer to Cranmer, 22 years late, and the answer to me will arrive for whoever is standing in this hollow in 20 years. Nobody had come because we crashed. Something had come because a hull stopped arriving somewhere 2 decades ago, and those are not the same event, and the distance between them is the whole of what the Imperium is. 3 days later, the second ship came, also a surveyor, also a single pass. It spent more time over the settlement and less time over the crash site, and it dropped something, a small object on a parachute that landed about 1 kilometer east of the human settlement, and which 2 of Cranmer's people retrieved before the Orks could get to it. It was a data slate, standard Imperial issue, sealed in a drop-proof case containing a single file. Cranmer worked out what it meant before I did, and when he said it out loud, I understood that Nelward's mast had been answered. You do not put a slate on a parachute for an orc. You put one down when your first pass has picked up an Imperial distress pattern coming off a greenskin world, and you would like to know what is producing it without landing to find out, because landing costs a shuttle and a crew, and an entry in a log, and dropping a form costs a form. 2 months of transmitting had bought us 17 questions. The file was a questionnaire. It asked 17 questions about the Ork settlement, population estimate, approximate technological level, presence of heavy armor, presence of void-capable craft, number of identifiable war bosses, evidence of warp activity. Question 14 asked whether any non-orcoid fauna had been observed in or near the settlement. Non-orcoid fauna. That was us. That was the word they used. Fauna. Not personnel, not survivors, not citizens, or subjects, or even humans. Fauna. A biological observation to be noted alongside the squigs, and the fungi and the six-legged insects that ate the dead, and which the grots ate in turn. We were a checkbox on a reconnaissance form, somewhere between number of visible artillery pieces and evidence of underground structures. Question 17 asked whether the fauna appeared to be of human origin. It offered 3 boxes. Yes, confirmed. Yes, probable, unable to determine. There was no box for yes, confirmed, please send rescue. There was no box for these are Imperial citizens who would very much like to come home. There was a box for unable to determine, which I suspect is the box that the surveyor would have ticked if he had been filling in the form himself, because from an altitude of 3,000 meters, through a spore haze that turned everything the color of old parchment, a group of 60-odd humans living in scrap shelters on the edge of a greenskin settlement does not look like a population. It looks like fauna. It looks like something that lives there, in the cracks, in the gaps, in the spaces between the things that the survey is actually interested in. Cranmer filled in the questionnaire. Pratt wanted to fill it in herself, and Cranmer let her read it first, and I watched her face as she got to question 14, and I watched her face change, and I watched her hand the slate back to Cranmer without a word, and walk away and sit on the ground with her back to us, and not move for about 20 minutes. A woman named Jessinder from Cranmer's original group tried to take the slate and smash it, and Cranmer stopped her, and she said something that I will not repeat because it was aimed at the Imperium, and it was the most precise assessment of Imperial personnel policy I have ever heard, and it contained 7 words, none of them polite, and all of them accurate. Cranmer answered all 17 questions accurately, thoroughly, and in the neat hand of a man who had once maintained a ship's log. He wrote his name and service number in the margin. He wrote the names and service numbers of every survivor from his ship and from ours. He sealed the slate in its case and left it at the drop point. And 2 days later, the 3rd surveyor came and collected it, and I watched it go up into the sky and disappear. And I felt nothing, because I had learned by then that feeling things about events I could not control was a waste of energy that could be better spent greasing the secondary engine, which had developed a rattle in the 3rd bearing that I was fairly certain was caused by particulate contamination in the lubricant. And fixing that rattle was something I could do, and waiting for the Imperium to come and save me was something I could not do, and the difference between those 2 things was the difference between being alive and being a checkbox on a form. The Imperium did not come, not in the way we wanted. On day 91, a frigate appeared in high orbit, visible for about 6 hours as a bright point of light that moved against the stars. and then it was gone. We did not know what it had done up there, but Cranmer, who had been through this before and who had learned to read the Imperium's silences the way a sailor reads weather, said it had completed its survey and filed its report. I have never seen that report, and I never will. A tallow-hand does not read subsector files, and there is nothing on Ghorrek to read one on. But I held the questionnaire in my hands for 2 days before Cranmer sealed it, and a form tells you the shape of the thing it feeds, the same way a bearing tells you what the shaft it came out of was doing. 17 questions: population, technological level, heavy armor, void-capable craft, identifiable war bosses, warp activity. Those are the lines of a threat assessment, and they are the whole of it. And every answer we gave was low or moderate or none. And then question 14 and question 17, which were not about the enemy at all, and which had their own boxes and their own place to go. You do not put a question on a reconnaissance form unless something downstream has a field waiting for the answer. Somewhere there is a field with us in it. Cranmer thinks it sits at the bottom of the same document, under whatever heading that Adeptus uses for the things it noticed and does not intend to act on. He calls it the appendix. He has called it that since before I got here, and when I asked him why, he said that every survey he ever sailed on filed the animals in an appendix, and that he has no reason to think this one is different. Appendix 7. 7 is where his own cutter's surveys always put the animals, across 9 years, often enough that he stopped needing to check. I think he is right, and neither of us can prove it. We were Appendix 7. 60-odd human beings, some of whom remembered their names and their service numbers, and the worlds they had been born on, and the ships they had served on, and the people they had left behind. And in the picture of that report I cannot stop assembling. We are a footnote, somewhere between evidence of underground structures and observed squig populations by size category. I want to be angry about that. I try to be angry about that. But anger requires a target, and the target was not a person or a policy or a decision. The target was a system so large that no single part of it could see the whole, and the part that had seen us correctly. We were fauna. We lived in the gaps. We ate what the ecosystem provided. We had adapted to our environment, biologically and socially, in exactly the way that fauna does. And the surveyor who had ticked the box had not been wrong. He had been precise. He had looked at us with the instruments available to him, and he had described what he had seen, and he had filed the description, and the description was accurate. And accuracy is the cruelest thing a bureaucracy can do to you, because a lie you can fight, and a mistake you can correct, and an injustice you can appeal. But when the system looks at you and sees exactly what you are, and writes it down and files it and moves on, there is nothing left to push against. The wall is not a wall. It is an open door with nothing on the other side. 96 days. That is where I am now. I am sitting in the corner of Wernkrunk's workshop, on a mat made of ship insulation with a grease bucket beside me and a grot asleep on my feet, and a secondary engine that needs attention in the morning. I know how to maintain 9 different machines in this workshop. I know the sound that a bearing makes when the grease is thinning, and the sound it makes when the sleeve is cracked, and the sound it makes when the alignment is off by a fraction of a degree. And I know that the third sound is the one that Wernkrunk cares about, because alignment is the difference between a machine that works and a machine that works for now, and Wernkrunk does not build things that work for now, he builds things that work. And their exploding sometimes is a separate issue that he considers beneath his professional attention. I have eaten nothing but mushrooms since the 5th day. My skin has a faint greenish tinge in the creases. My gut makes sounds that my gut did not used to make. wet gurgling sounds that are, I am fairly certain, the sound of orkoid microorganisms processing orkoid food in a human body that is no longer entirely human by any standard that the Imperium would recognize. I am contaminated. I am fauna. I am a small thing that fixes in a workshop on a planet that the galaxy has forgotten, and I am, in this moment, in a way that I have never been in 27 years of Imperial service, useful. Not potentially useful. Not useful if properly trained and deployed and supervised and managed by people who know better than me what I should be doing. Useful. Right now. Today. Because the secondary engine needs greasing, and I am the one who greases it, and nobody else in the workshop can do it, because the bearing caps require fingers smaller than an Orks and more skilled than a Grotz. And Wernkrunk knows this, and I know this, and the engine knows this, and that is a circle of competence that requires exactly one person to close, and the person is me. Bosun Pratt is still alive. She runs the human section of the workshop the way she ran the deck gang on the Measured Allotment, with a voice like a hull breach, and a refusal to acknowledge that anything in the universe is too large to be managed by a sufficiently determined woman with a metal strut and a list. She has learned 6 words of Orkish and uses none of them correctly, and the Grotz obey her anyway, because authority is a tone of voice before it is a language. And Pratt's tone of voice predates language by several evolutionary epochs. Cog Adept Nelward is still alive, because Wernkrunk will not let him leave the workshop, and because Nelward has discovered something that I believe is genuine professional satisfaction in working with a Mekboy whose instinctive understanding of machinery exceeds anything the Adeptus Mechanicus has achieved through 10,000 years of ritual and prayer. And Nelward will never say this out loud because it would be tech heresy of the highest order. But I have seen his face when Wernkrunk solves a problem that should not be solvable, and the expression on it is not horror, it is envy. He has also stopped correcting the work. For the first month, he would take a join apart after the mech had walked away and do it again properly at night and say nothing about it to anybody. He does not do that now. When I raised it, he said the second version kept failing and picked up the next thing on the bench. He knows the procedure better than I do. A servant of the machine god who has been in the hands of Xenos is not debriefed. He is opened to find out what he learned. Emil is still alive, clicking when he breathes, working the forge bellows because his chest plate makes him too stiff to do anything that requires bending. 2 of Kramer's children have started working in the workshop, a boy of 16 and a girl of 14 who speaks Orkish with the accent of a native and who can calm a squig with a word in a language I cannot learn. Cranmer says the skin takes about 6 months. I am about 3 months short of it, and I have looked and I cannot tell yet. And it does not matter, because the blood goes first, and the blood went weeks ago. So if a ship came down tomorrow, and if the men on it were here to take people off instead of to count orcs, the first thing that would happen to me is a medikey drawing 4 milliliters out of my arm, and the second thing is a form. I do not want that ship. Nobody issued the order. I ate what was here and drank what was here and breathed, and somewhere around the 3rd week the decision got made by something that does not take instructions, and by the time Cranmer told me what it meant, it had been made for a month. Steek stole my brush again this morning. I let him keep it. He will bring it back by evening, because he needs me to have the brush in order to grease the bearings. And he needs me to grease the bearings because greased bearings mean the engine runs smoothly, and a smooth engine makes Wernkrunk make the good sound, and the good sound means nobody gets thrown. And nobody getting thrown means Steek gets to keep sleeping on the exhaust manifold that he has claimed as his bed, which is warm, and which is warm because the engine is running, and the engine is running because I greased it. It is a circle, a small, absurd, green-skinned circle, turning on an axis of mushroom-scented grease and mutual exploitation. And it is the most functional working relationship I have ever been a part of. On Kaldevast, I was nobody. On the Measured Allotment, I was invisible. On Ghorrek, I am the tallow-hand in the Big Mek's workshop, and the Big Mek knows my hands, and the engine needs me tomorrow. I will be there,